I think I'll wrap this up to give more time to Patricia. But if there is a takeaway point from what I said today, the takeaway point is that the best way to help Iraqis is not to prolong the military occupation. It's not to say, let's give the troops a little bit more. Maybe they can just build like a couple of bridges. They don't want bridges. They don't want someone to stay there to help them build bridges. There are enough architects and engineers and bricks. People know how to build bridges for themselves. We have to stay there to protect women, and save them from oppression. Women don't need you to be there. In fact, my mother in the mid-70s was like a typical 70s feminist. Shouting. She fights with men when they stand up in the public transportation to let her sit down, because she thinks men and women are equal. So, I mean, now it looks funny, but I mean, at least she was a part of this Iraqi indigenous movement, women movement, to get women rights, whatever that movement looked like. Iraqi women had more rights than most of the women in the rest of the Middle East. And whether they decided to cover their hair or remove their hair, it's no one's business. I mean, that's not the indicator of freedom. Like hijab, poor woman, oppressed. Half naked, very free. I mean, it doesn't work that way, you know? I mean, seriously, it doesn't, I mean, when I move to the US, I can see, like, it's true. Sometimes systems of oppression do have manifestation. And sometimes people do oppress women to cover themselves. But sometimes men oppress women to uncover themselves, if this sounds familiar. Yeah. So I mean, like a friend of mine in France said she's left Iran, and she wrote these bad things about the Iranian government opposing hijab and stuff. So she went to France, and then in some few years the French government tries to use her to justify the campaign against hijab. She says, no, I'm not going to do that. It's the same thing. If you want to force them to put the piece of cloth or take it off, it's the same. So, women don't, I mean, I'm saying, like, indigenous movements for change don't need someone who can't talk their language, can't understand anything, to go all around the world and support them. People know how to take care of themselves. And the best gift to give to Iraqis or Iranians or Palestinians or whoever is to leave them alone. Number one. You know, I mean, building bridges with other people is really important. And I believe in this. If I didn't believe in this, I would be in Baghdad now, you know? But I believe in, like, you know, talking to others and learning other languages and stuff. But first we have to reach to a space where people's sovereignty and independence is respected, and then we build bridges with them. But we can't go invade other people's homes and, like, help them wash their dishes, you know? Like, get out first, let's, you know, have, like, define people's independence and borders. And if someone needs help, it's okay, you know? So where we stand now, at least in the case with Iraq, the best way to help Iraqis is not to fly there and help them. It's not to, like, reconcile the Sunnis and the Shiites. It's none of anyone's business. The best way to help Iraqis is to bring all the troops home from Iraq and close all the terminals. I'll repeat this to my next interview. Now, what Iraqis, you know, lost in the last years is our responsibility as U.S. taxpayers. Now, I am a U.S. taxpayer who is funding this war, and I find myself accountable for what's happening in Iraq as an individual. But now the point is that this responsibility is good. It should be appreciated. But we can't fulfill our responsibilities to Iraqis by prolonging a military occupation. Iraq occupied Kuwait in the early 90s. An illegal, immoral occupation that broke international law and Iraqi constitution. It's very similar to the US occupation to Iraq. And Iraq now is still paying compensation to Kuwait, 5% of its oil revenue to Kuwait as compensation. But we don't have Iraqi troops running around Kuwait city preventing a civil war or killing the bad guys, right? First, they were kicked out of Kuwait. They pulled out completely, left Kuwait to the Kuwaitis, and then they started searching for other venues to compensate or fix the crimes or mistakes that happened. Okay, I will stop here, and I don't know what are we going to do. Take questions or move to Patricia?
Okay, well, first, thank you. We'll just have about 10 or 15 minutes if you want to ask some questions for our first speaker, and then we're going to move on to our second speaker. But there also will be time at the end to ask both speakers any questions you come up with.
Hey, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah.
It may seem a dumb question, but I still can't figure out exactly why the United States wanted to invade Iraq or why they want to stay there. I mean, it's really hard to figure it out. I wonder if you have any thoughts on it.
Did you hear the question?
No.
No? What was the real reason why the US invaded Iraq in the first place and wants to stay there? I think it's a combination of reasons. Combination of reasons that vary from political to economical to religious reasons. Depends on which area we are talking about. But I think maybe the major things are having a control over the oil in that part of the world. Saudi Arabia is the first biggest oil reservoir in the world, and Iran and Iraq are the second and third biggest reserve. So Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia, they're like a huge oil field. And controlling the resources there is not just about looting the oil and bringing it to the US, but deciding who gets to buy the oil as well. Whether China will get the oil or Japan or whomever, So controlling natural resources at that part of the world is one of the major issues that push the US to interfere in that area all along. Religious reasons that are usually linked to the existence of Israel, religious and political reasons that are, either based on what the special interest groups in DC and the Israeli lobby is pushing to do in Washington, DC, and how that ends up forming the US policy around the world and in the Middle East in general. And I think there are a number of other political reasons that has to do with the war situation. Now, there are many other places in the world that have very similar interests to these ones, whether they are political or religious or economic. But then we reach to the original question: which philosophy of foreign policy are we going to adopt to achieve what we think must be achieved by us? As a big country, how are we going to get natural resources and energy? How are we going to support our religious beliefs or whatever? I think these are the questions that should be asked. Which type of foreign policy are we depending on? And about the current one, who is creating it? Because this is a valid question, and no one knows about it. Who is creating the U.S. foreign policy? Some people in the State Department and CIA. And it's not even the Congress. The Congress is like the biggest reactionary entity that doesn't do anything. But the other people in the other institutions that are not elected, you don't know who they are, right? But they end up framing the policy. Me and you, right? It's a small league of people who we don't know them. We don't know their faces. Who are